I know that I seem afraid, and I shouldn't be because Mr. Rosen was just cautioning me. He wasn't.
At some point, people stopped asking if she was telling the truth and started asking a different question. What if the story was never out of her control? Everything about her feels real. The emotions, the heartbreak, the way she tells it. But the more you look at what actually happens around her, the more things start to feel off. Every controversy should hurt her career. But somehow it doesn't. It makes her bigger. Every backlash should slow her down. But it doesn't. It disappears. And every time the narrative turns against her, it doesn't stay that way for long. It shifts. Quietly. Smoothly. Almost like it was always meant to. There was a moment where the entire world turned on her overnight. A phone call that changed everything. A story that seemed clear, until it wasn't. And years later, when more information came out, it didn't just fix the story. It made it more confusing. Because suddenly, what people believed before didn't fully line up anymore. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because when the same pattern keeps repeating, when every setback somehow turns into an advantage, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like something else. Something more controlled. And that's when you have to ask the question most people avoid. Is she always caught in the story, or has she been writing it all along? Taylor Swift didn't just rise to fame. She built something far more powerful than that. From the beginning, her image was clear. Honest. Emotional. Relatable. A young artist who turned real-life experiences into music people could feel. And that connection worked. Millions of listeners didn't just hear her songs. They believed them. They trusted her version of events. Over time, that trust turned into influence. Awards, records, sold-out tours, everything followed. But what made her different wasn't just the success. It was the control. She was always the one telling the story. Always the one framing what happened, how it felt, and why it mattered. And because it felt personal, people rarely questioned it. That's what made it so effective. The line between reality and storytelling became almost invisible. But when you look closely, something stands out. The stories are detailed where they need to be, and vague where they don't. Certain emotions are explained clearly, while certain facts are left open. And somehow, those gaps never seem to hurt the narrative. They strengthen it. Because they give the audience space to fill in the blanks themselves. And once people do that, the story becomes even more convincing. Even more real. But that raises a question. When one person controls how the story is told, how much of what we believe is actually complete? And how much of it is shaped? Because the more you look at the image she's built over time, the more it starts to feel less like something that just happened, and more like something carefully constructed. And that's where the story begins to shift. Long before the major controversies, the pattern was already there. It just didn't feel like a pattern yet. It felt like storytelling. Natural. Emotional. Real. But when you look back, the same structure keeps showing up. Early relationships with figures like Joe Jonas and Taylor Lautner didn't just stay private moments. They became narratives. Songs. Interpretations. Each one carrying a clear emotional direction. Someone hurt. Someone left. Someone responsible. And what's interesting is how little needed to be said directly. Names were rarely confirmed. Details were never fully explained. But the clues were always there. Enough for people to connect the dots on their own. And once they did, something important happened. The audience didn't feel like they were being told a story. They felt like they had discovered it. And that changes everything. Because when people believe they've figured something out themselves, they defend it. They repeat it. They build on it. Over time, this created a repeating structure. A relationship ends. A story follows. The story points in a direction. And the audience fills in the rest. And almost every time, the emotional position stayed the same. She was the one hurt. The one misunderstood. The one people sided with. At first, that feels relatable. Even comforting. But the more it repeats, the more consistent it becomes. And real life isn't that consistent. It's messy. It's unclear. It doesn't follow the same emotional pattern over and over again. But these stories did. Every time something ended, the narrative was already in place. And that's where things start to feel different. Not wrong. Not proven. Just unusual. Because when the same outcome keeps happening, even under different circumstances, it raises a question. Is it just coincidence? Or is there something guiding how these stories are told? At this point, nothing is obvious yet. Nothing feels extreme. But the pattern is there. Quiet. Repeating. Waiting to be noticed. And once it is, it becomes hard to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not gradually. Not quietly. Instantly. At the MTV Video Music Awards 2009, Taylor Swift stepped onto the stage to accept her award. Seconds later, Kanye West interrupted her in front of millions. It was chaotic. Awkward. Unforgettable. And the reaction was immediate. The public didn't hesitate. She was the victim. He was the villain. The story was simple. Clear. Easy to believe. And for years, that version stayed intact. It reinforced everything people already felt about her. But then, years later, the same story came back. And this time, it didn't look the same. In 2016, Kanye released a song with a controversial lyric about her. She pushed back publicly. He claimed she had approved it. Then Kim Kardashian released a recorded phone call. A short clip. Edited. But powerful enough to change everything. The internet reacted instantly. The narrative flipped. The same person who had once been defended by millions was now being questioned. Accused of being dishonest. Calculated. Manipulative. The word snake spread everywhere. And for the first time, the story wasn't hers anymore. It was being shaped by everyone else. Viral clips. Partial information. Public reaction moving faster than facts. And the shift wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Overwhelming. Total. Everything people believed about her started to crack. And then, just as quickly as it all escalated, she disappeared. No long explanations. No attempt to fully correct the narrative, in real time. Just silence. And that silence mattered. Because it left the story unfinished. Unresolved. Open to interpretation. At the time, it felt like a loss of control. Like the narrative had slipped away. But looking back, that moment feels different. Because what happened next didn't follow the expected path. There was no slow recovery. No gradual rebuild. What came next was something else entirely. A return that didn't just respond to the narrative, but reshaped it. And that's when the pattern stopped being subtle. When she came back, it didn't feel like a recovery. It felt like a shift in strategy. Taylor Swift didn't try to undo what people were saying about her. She leaned into it. The album Reputation didn't avoid the snake narrative. It embraced it. The criticism, the backlash, the image people used against her, everything was pulled into the story and turned into part of the brand. And that's where things start to feel different. Because instead of correcting the narrative, she redirected it. She didn't remove the controversy. She used it. And the result wasn't damage control. It was growth. Bigger numbers. More attention. Stronger presence. Which raises a question. If controversy consistently leads to expansion, is it still just a setback? Or does it become something else entirely? Then in 2020, the full version of the phone call from 2016 surfaced online. Not the edited clip. The entire conversation. And suddenly, the story shifted again. Not in a clean way. Not in a way that clearly proved one side right and the other wrong. But in a way that introduced doubt. Enough doubt to make people reconsider what they thought they knew. For some, it felt like validation. that she had been judged too quickly. For others, it made the situation even more complicated. Because if the truth wasn't clear the first time, why was the reaction so certain? And why didn't she respond more directly when it mattered most? That's where the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Because this wasn't just about one situation. It was about how situations unfold. Something happens. The narrative escalates. There's a pause. Then a return. But not just any return, a stronger one. A more controlled one. One that reframes everything that came before it. And surrounding all of this is something even more powerful. Her audience. The fanbase that doesn't just observe, but participates. They analyze lyrics, track timelines, connect details, and defend her aggressively when needed. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because when millions of people believe your version of the story, it doesn't just spread. It solidifies. It becomes harder to question. Not because it's proven, but because it's accepted. And once that happens, the line between narrative and reality becomes even harder to see. At this point, it stops feeling like isolated events. It starts to feel connected. Like each controversy, each silence, each comeback is part of a repeating structure. And whether that structure is intentional or not, that's the question that keeps coming back. Because once you notice the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you start questioning it, the story doesn't feel the same anymore. By now, the pattern isn't subtle anymore. It's visible. Repeating. Hard to ignore. And then another major moment adds to it. In 2019, Taylor Swift publicly addressed the ownership of her master recordings after they were acquired by Scooter Braun. She described it as something deeply personal. A loss of control over her own work. The reaction followed a familiar direction. Fans rallied behind her immediately. The narrative formed quickly. She had been wrong. She was fighting back. But what happened next didn't stay in the realm of statements. It turned into action. She began re-recording her old albums, releasing them as new versions. And what could have been symbolic became something much bigger. The re-recordings didn't just succeed. They dominated. Commercially. Culturally. Strategically. It wasn't just reclaiming music. It was redefining ownership in a way that shifted the industry itself. And once again, the outcome followed the same structure. A setback turned into an advantage. A conflict turned into momentum. And that's where the question becomes harder to avoid. Is this resilience? Or is it something more calculated? Because when the same type of outcome keeps happening, even under completely different circumstances, it stops feeling accidental. And while all of this was happening, another controversy started building quietly. Reports about private jet usage. Environmental criticism. Data being discussed publicly. And the response this time was different. Much more limited. No detailed breakdown. No extended narrative. Just brief statements through representatives. And that contrast stands out. Because in some situations, every detail is explained. Every emotion is shared. The story is clear. But in others, the silence stays. Not denied. Not fully addressed. Just left there. And when you compare those moments side by side, something becomes clear. When speaking strengthens the narrative, it happens. When it doesn't, it fades. Not completely gone. Just not expanded. And that's where things begin to feel selective. Not random. Not chaotic. But shaped. Carefully. Consistently. In a way that keeps the overall story moving forward. No matter what direction it starts in. At this point, the story doesn't move in one direction anymore. It splits. Two completely different interpretations, both convincing in their own way. On one side, Taylor Swift is seen as someone who has been repeatedly misunderstood. Someone whose words were taken out of context. Someone who became a target simply because of how visible and successful she is. From this perspective, every controversy fits into a familiar pattern of public overreaction. A cycle where attention turns into criticism, and criticism turns into narrative. But on the other side, there's a different idea. One that doesn't focus on what happened, but on how it plays out. The consistency. The timing. The outcomes. Some observers believe it's not just about reacting to situations, but understanding them deeply. Knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to let the story evolve on its own. There is no confirmed evidence that everything is controlled. But the pattern itself is what keeps raising questions. Especially when you look at how certain moments unfold repeatedly. Take the renewed attention around past relationships with figures like Jake Gyllenhaal and John Mayer. When songs connected to those periods resurface, public discussion follows. Speculation increases. Online reactions intensify. And often, those reactions turn into direct criticism toward the people believed to be involved. Yet, clear confirmation rarely comes. The stories stay just open enough to continue. Not fully defined. Not fully closed. And that ambiguity matters. Because it allows the narrative to keep growing without needing to be corrected. And in a space where attention drives everything, that kind of open-ended story can be powerful. Not because it proves anything, but because it keeps people engaged. Still, it's important to stay grounded. There is no single explanation that fully defines these patterns. No clear line between intention and coincidence. What exists instead are repeated outcomes. Similar structures. Moments that, when viewed individually, seem normal. But when placed together, feel different. More connected. More consistent than expected. And that's why this part of the story remains the most debated. Because it doesn't offer a conclusion. It offers a question. One that doesn't have a clear answer. Only perspectives. And depending on how you see it, the entire story changes. By the time you reach the end of this story, it doesn't feel simple anymore. Taylor Swift isn't just an artist telling her truth. And she isn't just a public figure reacting to events around her. She exists somewhere in between. In a space where storytelling, perception, and reality blend together in ways that aren't always clear. Over the years, she has shown an ability to move through controversy in a way very few people can. Not just surviving it, but turning it into momentum. And that alone is undeniable. But what remains unclear is how much of that is reaction, and how much of it is understanding. Because when you look at the patterns, the timing, the way certain moments are explained while others are left open, it doesn't point to a single answer. It points to complexity. Maybe she has been misunderstood more than most people realize. Or maybe she understands the system better than anyone watching from the outside. Maybe both can be true at the same time. And that's what makes this story difficult to define. Not because there isn't enough information, but because there's too much that doesn't fully connect in a simple way. In the end, the question isn't just about what she has or hasn't explained. It's about why some things never seem to need explaining at all. Because in a world where attention shapes reality, the way a story is told can matter just as much as what actually happened. And maybe that's the point. Maybe she doesn't explain everything, because she doesn't have to. Or maybe the full story was never meant to be fully understood. If you find stories like this interesting, where things don't quite add up the way they should, there's always more beneath the surface. And sometimes, the stories that feel the most complete are the ones worth questioning the most.